Welcome to the Intercourse Show. I am your host, Mr. B. Today we have a very exciting show for you. We are discussing the U.S. debt problem and the implications that it has on some of its political decisions. As some of you know, Trump recently invaded Venezuela, and some are saying he kidnapped Maduro on a special U.S. operation because he simply didn't like Maduro as a leader for Venezuela. Maduro wasn't complying with the U.S. interest. So for that reason, Trump took actions that I think a lot of Congress members and senators wanted to take in against Maduro. And he essentially took the man and he's holding him trial under the guise of drug trafficking, sex trafficking, and human trafficking, and that he's not a legitimate president of that country. But at the core, behind closed doors, there's far more to the story. Now, today we're going to explore some other facts that's emerged about, that's also supported by numbers about the condition of the United States in terms of its finances. For some who are not familiar with this, but we're like $32 trillion in debt. And apparently that debt is leading some of the decisions that we're making politically and some of the chances that we're taking. We are going to review a presentation by a man named Richard Wolff, who's an economist and who brings a lot of this information to surface. So without any further ado, let's jump right into it.
More cars in China than it does in the United States. The best electric car in the world right now is made in China. Most of you never heard of it. It's made by the BYD Corporation. Did you ever hear of that? I can tell from your faces, most of you didn't. By the way, if I understand correctly, BYD stands for Build Your Dream. What an irony. The Chinese company produced the best electric vehicles in the world at the lowest price. But now you have the best part of the story. Corporations and the rich have told the government, started about 3 weeks ago, we're not willing to lend you anymore because you're too deep in debt. You're too risky to lend to. Whoa. Who told the government that? The single largest creditor of the United States. That is the country known as Japan. Japan is now the country that has lent the most money to the United States government. I'm now going to take 2 minutes to give you a lesson in high finance, which, as you'll discover, isn't very high at all. Real simple, as is most of this stuff in economics. It just has to be explained clearly. The government of the United States is the most indebted government in the world. Nobody comes close. Who lends to the United States government? The United States government doesn't care. You can be a person, you can be a company, you can be a bank, you can be domestic, you can be foreign. That's why the biggest creditor is Japan. What might surprise you is to learn who is the second biggest creditor, just a little less than Japan.
This game, you're not ready for it.
Answer: the People's Republic of China. If you want to understand the relative situation of the United States and China, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, one of the first things you need to understand is we're the debtor, they're the creditor, and you know which is the better position of those two to be in. Yeah. And this gives you an idea of also the complexity of the world. China is allied with Russia and is therefore on the side of Russia in the war in Ukraine. The United States is on the side of Ukraine, fighting against the Russians. How does the United States pay for that war in Ukraine? It has two ways of doing it. Number one, it could tax us all. You could get a letter in the mail from Uncle Sam, or in this case, Uncle Don. And Uncle Don would say, I'm fighting the war in Ukraine. It's very, very expensive. So I'll need an extra $4,628 from you this year and probably next year too. Have a nice day. You want to see the war in Ukraine come to a screeching halt? Try that. We don't fight wars with taxes because we couldn't get away with it from the American people.
That's a good point. That a lot of people don't even give the thought to worry about, to consider really. The U.S. borrows money to fight wars. Probably a lot of companies do that. Countries do that. You see, obviously, Ukraine is in the midst of fighting the war, and Zelensky's always on some fundraising mission to get money from other places so he can fight his wars. So, I mean, it's not just the U.S. All countries tend to have funding in order to be able to sustain an ongoing conflict with another country. So if we have such high debt, it's because we've poured a lot of money into our defense companies and just into a lot of wasteful agendas and stuff like that. That's really not serving the people. And this is a fair point that he made. Like he's saying that Russia, for instance, is at war with Zelensky, and they're allied with China, but China is a major debtor of ours. So while we're lending money or giving money to Zelensky to fight the war, we're getting it from China, who's allied with Russia, to sustain this fight. And at some point, the debtor is subjected to the lender's demands.
Only borrow for the war, because that way we don't have to go. And we've been doing that, a lot of it. We borrowed for Vietnam, we borrowed for Afghanistan, we borrowed for Iraq, we borrowed for the Ukraine. We borrow until the lenders say, no more. And that's what the Japanese have done. But enjoy it. Remember, the Chinese are on the side of the Russians. But the Chinese lend to the United States, which uses the money to fight the Russians. Uh-oh, it's getting confusing. You need everybody to wear a jersey to know who's on what team. That's how bad it is. Our debts are now about $35 trillion. Our annual output of goods and services is about 25. We're in debt like this. We're in debt like the worst relative in your family is in debt. The one who has maxed out 11 cards already and is having trouble getting the 12th one. We're in trouble. And Mr. Trump is doing what conservatives always do when their management of the system has gotten them into trouble. They're taking it out on you. So we're going to lay off thousands of people at the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. You know what that means? That the next pandemic will be worse because we're not checking people. We're not doing it. Food and Drug Administration. When that milk you drink tastes funny, that's because 11 sheep did something in it that you don't want to hear about. Well, we don't have the personnel anymore. We're cutting the budgets left and right. Just a little footnote. General Motors sells more cars in China than it does in the United States. The best electric car in the world right now is made in China. Most of you never heard of it. It's made by the BYD Corporation. Did you ever hear of that? I can tell from your faces, most of you didn't. By the way, if I understand correctly, BYD stands for Build Your Dream. What an irony. The Chinese company produced the best electric vehicles in the world at the lowest price. There was a competition over the last 10, 15 years to build electric cars. You know all about that, to replace the gas-burning cars. That competition was won by a Chinese company. How did the United States handle that? By excluding it. Mr. Trump started with a 27.5% tariff, and Mr. Biden raised it to 100%. So if you want to get a $30,000 electric car or truck from China, here's how you do it. You send $30,000 to China, they send you the truck. But if you want to pick it up at the dock, you got to pay 100% again, another $30,000 to Uncle Sam, making the final cost to you $60,000, which you all as Americans say, no thank you, too expensive. There are no BYD trucks and cars on the roads in this country. But if you go to Europe right now, they're all over the place. Why? Because Europeans want to buy the best, cheapest car. You might like it too. Tough. You don't get to do that. Who does that protect? General Motors, Ford, and Tesla, because they are producing their cars somewhere other than China. Wow. Wow. You're the victim here over and over again. But that's just the beginning. I'm now going to tell you things that ought to scare you. This is an act, an aggressive economic damage done by Mr. Trump to every country on earth. Every one of them now realizes that their market in the United States is in trouble. Americans are going to have to pay a tax to Uncle Sam to get the French wine or the Belgian chocolate or the computer part or the Apple phones, all made in China. Come on. Your morning latte, if this goes through, will set you back $25. How often are you going to go then? Starbucks is in a complete tizzy. Their business is disappearing. Nobody can afford it anymore. We're becoming a country that looks like those we used to watch on National Geographic programs on TV. A few rich people in a few elegant cities surrounded by a vast sea of poverty. That's where we're going, folks. It is so obvious now that for people like me, I have to stop at a certain point, as I will this evening, because I don't want you all to get depressed. From your faces, I can see I've already reached that with some of you. The United States is part of a group of nations that are allied. Well, these days I have to qualify that. Were allied. They're called the G7. It's the United States, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Italy, and Germany. That used to be the powerhouse center of the world in the second half of the 20th century. If you add up the total output of goods and services of the G7, the United States and its major allies, it amounts to about 28% of the total output of our planet. Now I'm going to mention another group, the People's Republic of China and their allies, who have a name. It's called the BRICS, B-R-I-C-S. That was originally 5 countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And another 20 or so, or 18, have joined. That's another block. What is the total output of goods and services of the block of China and its allies, the BRICS? Answer, 35% of world output. That's already a much bigger economic unit than the United States and its major allies. It's over. We are not the center of the world economy the way we were. Every country in the world is rethinking its strategy, political, economic, military, ideological. Every company in the world that has any international business is trying to figure out, what does this mean? When African countries these days are trying to figure out, where do we get the money to build the railroads that we need? They used to go to New York or London or Paris. They still go to New York, London, and Paris. But as soon as that trip is over, they go to New Delhi, Beijing, and Sao Paulo. And then they go with a better deal, which is why most of the railroads in Africa today are built by the Chinese. Why most of the ports.
This is a good point for me to stop and add some thoughts. This is news to me. I wasn't aware that the G7 countries, their output is 25 trillion. And the BRIC countries, which would be the Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, their output is 35 trillion. So, and those countries represent a major block of the world's population. I mean, both China and India both have over 1 billion people. So it's a huge market. China and India is the second and potentially the fourth biggest economies to sell to. And also, they're 2 of those 3 countries are nuclear powers. So it is a different scenario in terms of what they're able to produce from a gross domestic product standpoint. versus what the G7 countries have been able to produce from a gross domestic product standpoint. I didn't know that that number had been passed, like that the BRIC countries had surpassed production of the G7 countries. And it's true, those things are going to play a factor in how we make political moves because we're trying to change the axis and balance of power. So because those countries now have a lot more weight, it does change how we have to approach them.
Emerging on the coasts of Latin America are Chinese. It's not just your underpants. It's everywhere. And there is no end of that in sight. The International Monetary Fund, a Western agency that cannot be accused of any leftism whatsoever, tells us that in the last year, 2024, the United States economy grew by 2.8%, which was better than all of the other G7 countries. The IMF tells us that China last year grew 5%, double the rate of the United States, and India, another member of the BRICS, grew 7%.
So between India and China, they grew 12%. And they're two major countries in the BRICS economy. So it's showing that there's a lot of growth coming from them because they produce a lot and they have a lot of talent that's coming out of those areas. But the U.S. is growing at a much slower pace, 2.8%. And they're the only country out of the G7 that seems to have been growing at this pace. A lot of the European countries are not growing much at all. If they're growing and not declining. So there is a reversal in economic balance of power, which is why a lot of these countries are venturing off and trying to figure out how do they do business with some of these BRIC countries, these major powers, the Chinas, the Indias. They've outcasted Russia, but essentially this dynamic is in play.
In other words, the gap, which is already in favor of China, is growing even more in favor of China. The United States doesn't know what to do. It has no coherent policy. The tariffs? You must be kidding. The tariffs against China. We are going to contain China. The older ones of you might remember that's what was said about the Soviet Union after World War II. George Kennan came up with the plan. We're going to contain them. We're going to put military bases all around them, which we did. We're going to build alliances around them, NATO, which we did. And we're going to bring them to their knees, which we did. We did. So the same policy is being pursued with regard to China. It's even called a Cold War or a new Cold War against China. This is the worst mistake imaginable, economically speaking. Why? Because the relationship between the United States and China is completely different from the relationship between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, for those of you who never paid attention or were never taught this stuff, and in America it's mostly the latter, the Soviet Union was never an economic competitor of the United States. It never came close to anything remotely like that. I can show you that right now. Remember I said a few moments ago, the GDP, the gross domestic output of the United States, about $26 trillion right now. What is the size of the Russian economy? You know, the inheritor, what's left of the Soviet Union today? Between 3 and 4 trillion. You understand? 25 trillion, 3 and 4. That's an elephant and that's a mouse. Russia may have had nuclear weapons, may have been a military problem, but an economic problem? Not at all. Never. Not even a little bit. China is completely different. Why? Because they are an economic competitor. That's why your toaster underneath says made in China. They make everything. We make nothing.
This is another valid point that he made. Not only is China an economic threat in that their economy is relatively big, but they're also a nuclear threat as well, because they're one of the nuclear holding countries, nuclear capable countries. So they're an economic threat and they're a nuclear holding country. Not only that, but they're a major member of the BRICS. India is a emerging economy, and they're also a nuclear threat. So a lot of countries on their side are really sort of economically sound or formidable opponents of the US, but they're also militarily, capable as well. So the dynamic is different between the new Cold War, the G7 countries versus the BRIC countries, and the old Cold War, which would have been the US and the G7 countries versus Russia. It's a totally different environment. So
Almost. I'm exaggerating, but you get the idea. Our businesses went there. So did the Japanese, so did the Europeans. They all went for the same reason: profit. It's how capitalism works. We're left with the results of how capitalism works. And by the way, the companies that went to China, they did make a big profit. That was a smart move that they did for their profits. That movement began to get really big in the 1970s and 80s. And the stock market performance in this country, for those of you who've paid attention, has been really good in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even to the present. If you were a participant in the stock market, you got a share of the extra profits that came. But if you weren't, you didn't. The richest 10% of Americans own 80 to 85% of all the shares. You're not part of that group unless you're a very unusual person. And in that case, please give me a loan after the CLED. You understand? The United States is facing the first serious economic competitor in this country's last century. No wonder we're living in a different world. If you want to know why Mr. Xi Jinping from China can stand up and tell Mr. Trump where to go, it's because he can stand up and tell him where to go. He's doing it because he can.
Richard Wolff, and a U.S. economist, a well-known economist, really kind of giving some numbers to support, the state of the U.S. economy and how, we're really in debt up to our eyeballs, and how that debt poses the biggest economic threat, but also military threat to us as well. And so for people who don't understand the urgent steps that you see being taken militarily, the aggressive nature by which Trump is governing the country, it has everything to do with this sense that the U.S. got themselves into such a hole that now they don't really know how to get out of the hole. And now they're exerting all this military force to try to intimidate and rebalance the axis of power. Again, there's a lot of bright spots with the U.S. in that it does have a productive population. There is a lot of great technology, and a lot of the leading world companies come from here. But at the same time, too, it's a matter of mismanagement from the leadership standpoint in terms of why we're in the hole that we're in. So as you see policies come out, especially ones where it seems brazen, like a United States president outright kidnapping the leader of a major oil producing country in you know what I mean, in broad day, and essentially doing it just because, that has a lot to do with the condition that we're in and the sense of desperation that the U.S. feels. So to me, there is some truth to what he said about the U.S. debt problem being a problem, a concerning problem as a whole, for the U.S. and for the American people. And so, because a lot of the debtors can now set the rules and say, well, we're not going to lend you any more money, or we want repayment on this money. And some argue that the U.S. don't fully intend to pay the money, which is why there's been some controversy around Colin Powell. Powell, I don't want to say Colin Powell because I know he's a general, but Powell is the Fed chairman who refuses to reduce the rate because we're technically have a $32 trillion debt and we're paying a high rate on the debt. And if he reduced the rate, then it would mean our payments would be more manageable. But because he refused to reduce the rate, we've been paying this exorbitant amount of interest payments based on the fact that this man refuses to reduce the rate. So that's something that Trump is trying to work through. But the problem is that we're in such debt in the first place. I mean, we're spending trillions of dollars on our military alone. And, when all fails, you might as well lean in on the military that you've been spending a lot of money to prop up, so that when people want their money back, we could take a different position and say, no, we're not going to give it, or we're going to restructure the rules, or we're going to do this, or we're going to take over these resources for the sake of being able to pay down these debts, i.e. U.S. interests. So I thought this was a useful presentation by Richard Wolff, the economist, to kind of bring some perspective to people who are trying to understand it and make sense of it. Obviously, I am not an economist, but I think it's always good to kind of try to find ways to simplify the information for people who are not in this particular field, to be able to understand it and just have more context to why things are happening. For me, it was helpful, and I thought it'd be helpful to share with my audience. With that said, I'm Mr. B. Thank you for joining me on the Intercourse Show. If you're not already a subscribed member, I urge you to join the show and to be a part of our community, to weigh in on the conversation, to share, like, and subscribe the video. And until we speak again, God bless you.